a question, please raise your hand and we are going to open the microphone for you. And just to say, if you're following this press conference, you're not a journalist, but you're interested to know what is going on here at the bank, what we're planning to do for the annual meetings, you can follow us on our social media accounts, on Facebook, on X or Twitter as we know it, on LinkedIn as well, and of course on YouTube where this is being streamed live. And this is, you can use hashtag AFDBAM2024. That's hashtag AFDBAM2024. My name is Solomon Mugera, and it's my pleasure now to hand over to our Secretary General, Professor Mehele. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Solomon. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, good morning here in Abidjan, good afternoon wherever you may be, and possibly good evening somewhere else. And thank you for accepting our invitation to this press conference. As Director Solomon Mugera had said, my name is Vincent Mehele, Secretary General of the African Development Bank Group. I'm joined here by my colleagues, Professor Kevin Orama, Chief Economist and Vice President for Economic Governance and Knowledge Management, and the gentleman who just introduced me, Mr. Solomon Mugera, Director of Communications of the bank. Solomon, I thank you and your team for organizing this traditional event. As you may be aware, the African Development Bank Group consists of a number of entities, primarily the African Development Bank and the African Development Fund, with the Nigeria Trust Fund, and as well as other trust funds forming part of the entity. The bank and the fund have separate governance organs. In other words, they have separate boards of governance as well as separate boards of directors. On the other hand, the Nigeria Trust Fund is a special trust fund of the bank and therefore does not have a separate governance organ and is overseen by the board of directors of the bank. As Secretary General of the Bank Group, I am Secretary to the respective boards of governance of the bank and the fund, as well as the boards of directors of both. It is in this capacity that I wish to share with you, the press, some pertinent information with regard to the 2024 annual meetings, which is the foremost statutory event on the governance calendar of the African Development Bank Group this year. For these particular annual meetings, we expect upward of up to 4,000 participants at the meetings. Now, I would like to go over in terms of the date and the venue of the meeting. From the 27th to the 31st of May this year, the 59th session of the Board of Governors of the bank and the 50th session of the Board of Governors of the fund will be held jointly at the Kenyatta International Convention Center in Nairobi, Kenya. Kenya was selected by the boards of governors to host the 2024 annual meetings following its expression of interest to do so and after a determination by an evaluation mission from the bank that the country has the capacity to host the meetings. You may want to know what are the objectives of the annual meetings. The annual meetings are primarily a statutory event of the bank group. During the meetings, the boards of governors, as the heads decision-making and oversight organs of the bank and the fund, will review the annual report on the finances, operations, and other activities of the bank and the fund during the preceding financial year. The governors will then adopt resolutions on key decisions and conclusions of the annual meetings. There will also be a governors' dialogue, which will provide a platform for governors to interact and engage with the president of the bank group and senior management on issues of strategic significance to the continent and the bank. The proposed theme of the Governors' Dialogue is mobilizing the private sector to accelerate Africa's transformation. Given that this edition of the Governors' Dialogue will take place at a critical juncture when the continent continues to face a set of interlocking crises, the dialogue among various other areas will reflect on the bank group's new 10-year strategy that is aimed at accelerating Africa's transformation, explore ways in which the bank and other multilateral development banks could respond optimally to the call on them to work better together to significantly scale up resources for the sustainable development of the continent, and focus on the bank's role in mobilizing the private sector in the work of multilateral development banks within the context of the multilateral development bank's evolution for the purpose of accelerating Africa's development. One notable thing about the 2024 annual meetings is that the African Development Bank turns 60 this year, which is a very significant milestone. As you may be aware, the agreement establishing the African Development Bank was signed by member states on 4 August 1963 in Khartoum, Sudan, and the agreement came into force on the 10th of September 1964. While commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the bank will be year-long, it will commence with a short event on day 3 of the annual meetings under the theme, The African Development Bank, 60 Years of Making a Difference. Other events whose details will be announced to the public in due course are planned across the continent in the course of the year, culminating in the actual anniversary date. You may want to find out what the theme of the annual meetings this year is. The theme for the annual meetings this year is Africa's Transformation, the African Development Bank, and the Reform of the Global Financial Architecture. And this theme is set against the realization that despite a sustained economic growth over 2 decades, Africa's economic transformation remains quite incomplete. In addition to the statutory dimension of the annual meetings that I have just highlighted, the bank will organize a series of knowledge events under the both theme that I have indicated. The knowledge events will therefore explore how best to fast-track structural transformation across the continent. The events will also address the importance of a reconfigured global financial architecture as an engine for structural transformation. And of course, the Chief Economist and Vice President Rama will elaborate on the knowledge events in the course of the press briefing. Let me turn to giving you highlights of the annual meetings program. For now, I'd like to take you through the program of the annual meetings with a specific focus on the statutory aspects. The detailed program is available on the annual meetings website. I need to emphasize that all the statutory events will be closed to the public because it's business time for shareholders. On day 1, 3 of the statutory organs of the boards of governors, namely the Bureau, the Joint Steering Committee, and the Steering Committee on the election of the President, will meet to discuss various items on the agenda. The Governors' Dialogue will be held on day 2 in 2 sessions, with the first session planned for the period 9 to 12, and the second session from 2:15 to 5:15 in the evening. The formal opening ceremony of the annual meetings will be held on day 3 from 10 to 11. And of course, the opening ceremony is open to the public. Also on day 3, the first sittings of the Board of Governors will be held from 15:30 to 18:30. During this particular session, the Board of Governors will review and, as appropriate, approve recommendations from the various subsidiary organs and adopt relevant resolutions. The second sitting of the Board of Governors will be held on day 5, which is from 11 to 1 p.m., during which the official communique and the official records of the bank will be considered and adopted by governors. Of course, that session will be followed by the closing ceremony, which will hold soon after from 1:30 to about 2:30, where there will be a ceremonial handover of the chairperson's position, chairperson of the Board of Governors position, to the next chairperson. Let me also highlight that as part of the annual meeting, there will be a series of side events on the sidelines of the annual meetings to support the major programs that are going on, in which civil society and a number of private organizations, as well as public organizations, will be holding some meetings. Now, I will call on the Chief Economist and Vice President, Economic Governance and Knowledge Management, to address you on the knowledge events, which is based on the theme of the annual team's meeting. On the theme of the annual meetings. He will be followed by the Director of Communications and External Relations, who will address you on the press events planned for the annual meeting. Following their addresses, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to welcoming you to the annual meetings in Nairobi in late May. Thank you very much. Vice President Rama, over to you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. As already indicated by the Secretary General, the annual meetings, in addition to the statutory meetings that he has discussed, will also feature several knowledge events that is structured around the theme of the annual meetings: Africa's transformation, African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture. We're going to have 4 separate knowledge events that will be featured during the annual meetings. The first one will be the presidential dialogue, which will bring heads of states and government to have a focused dialogue on the theme of the annual meetings, considering how Africa has fared in its transformation, the role of the African Development Bank in enhancing and fast-tracking that transformation, and what roles the emerging reforms in the global financial architecture could play in accelerating Africa's transformation. Then second, we will have a high-level event that will be the launch of the African Economic Outlook Report 2024, the annual report that shapes the compass of Africa's development that is produced by the African Development Bank annually. This year's theme for the African Economic Outlook Report will be Africa's transformation, the reform of the global financial architecture. Again, focusing on how Africa's transformation has fared, what have been the key drivers of this transformation, and what role the global financial architecture plays in that transformation of the African continent. In addition to this high-level knowledge event, we will feature 2 thematic events that are focusing on selected themes that, based on our research, are key to Africa's transformation. And one of them is financing Africa's transformation in a changing global financial system. In all our research, you find that financing has always remained one of the major constraints of accelerated transformation on the continent. So these particular knowledge events will bring global experts in the financial system to be able to look at how to finance Africa's transformation in the changing global financial system. Then the second thematic event will be driving it home to look at the role of Africa's natural resources and economic productivity in Africa. So that event will be on the theme measuring the green wealth of nations, natural capital, and economic productivity in Africa. So here we're going to be seeing how Africa's natural resources could actually help drive that transformation on the continent even better than it has in the preceding years over the decades that we have seen. And then, of course, there will be other events marking the 60th anniversary of the African Development Bank Group, as already clearly described by the Secretary General of the bank group. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kevin Chika Rama. Professor Rama is the Chief Economist and Vice President for Governance and Knowledge Management. And earlier on, of course, you heard from the Secretary General and members of the press. You've had a really detailed rundown of what exactly the bank is planning to do in Nairobi. You've heard the purpose of the annual meetings. You've heard about the venue, which is at the Kenyatta International Conference Center in Nairobi, and the dates there you go, the 27th to the 31st of May. And the theme has been very well laid out by the Secretary General and also the Chief Economist, Africa's Transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and Reform of the Global Financial Architecture. You've heard about the knowledge events that are going to be held there, the launch of the annual Economic Outlook Report, and of course, very, very new, perhaps to those of us in journalism. For many years, we've never had an opportunity to know and how to calculate Africa's green wealth in natural resources, but this is now an opportunity for Africa to do exactly that. You've heard about the 60th anniversary of the bank coming up in September this year, but of course, we're beginning our plans for celebrating the achievements of the bank over the 60 years from, of course, on the, when we are in Nairobi for the annual meetings. In terms of the press, just to say, on the 27th of May, it's normally a tradition for the president of the bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, to address the press on the eve of the official opening of the annual meetings. And therefore, on the 27th of May, members of the press who will be in Nairobi will definitely be sending you details of how you will participate in that. And also, if you need to have access to any of the leaders from the bank, and the governors will be coming around, as well as other maybe executive directors and other officials, please do communicate with the Communication and External Relations Department, and we are going to make everything possible for you to be able to have interviews or to seek clarification about what you'll have heard. So we are there to serve you, and please seize that opportunity. We've got quite a number of colleagues, journalists on the line who are ready to ask questions, and I'm here with my colleagues Solange, Kamwanga Tosu, and Chief Emeka. They're going to be looking out for your questions and prompting us so that we come to you. Solange, I think we should be starting with Agri Mutambo. Agri Mutambo, is he on the line? Are you on the line, Agri, or I can read your question? Okay, Agri Mutambo, if Agri you can hear, over to you with your question. Agri Mutambo from the East African, based in Nairobi. Can we hear Agri, please? Yes, his microphone should be open by now. Agri Mutambo in Nairobi, if Dosa, if you can help us to get Agri on, that should be fine. It's open. It's open now. Yes, we can. Go ahead, Agri. Thank you. Okay, that's your first question. The second one? Okay, thank you so much. We'll take two more questions. I've got Maureen Chigbo. Maureen, hi, Maureen. Yes, good morning. Go ahead.
create wealth for its people. And what is the AFDB doing in this direction? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. I think all those questions are almost similar. The first one was about COVID-19 interventions by the bank, what's been the impact, and then we went into green bonds, the same question that Maureen, you've asked, and then the other one was transformation of Africa's economies. It's taking so long, what's happening? Professor Mele.
Look, I'll just deal with the first question, and then the rest, which are difficult questions, can go to Professor Rama. With regard to the first question, COVID-19 will not be on the agenda as such, I mean, for the annual meetings. I don't know if you recall, the bank did quite a lot to support African governments when the COVID-19 hit. When the Ukraine conflict, the war in Ukraine came up, they did a whole lot, the bank did a whole lot to support on the food security aspect of it. And that has spurred quite a lot of food production in a number of African countries. And the COVID-19 relief to African countries resulted in tackling some of the challenges in the various areas. We've seen hospitals enhanced as a result. We've seen vaccine production or importation enhanced. We've seen even the setting up of, if you like, industries that are aimed at enhancing Africa's resilience in the health sector. And one of the primary institutions recently that came out of that is the establishment of the Africa Technology Pharmaceutical Foundation, which the bank has spearheaded with the headquarters in Rwanda, which is aimed at ensuring that Africa is able to deal with issues around intellectual property related to transfer of technology in the areas of pharmaceuticals from those who would be very reluctant to deal with Africa. So there's been a whole lot of success that we cannot, I mean, this press conference will not be enough to tell you all the success stories across Africa arising from the COVID-19 relief. Impliedly, of course, Africa's transformation has to deal with how Africa has been able to survive all the challenges it went through, including COVID. But centrally, it will not be an issue that is on the agenda per se. Thank you very much. I hand over to Professor Rama to deal with the others, which are interconnected.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. The second question is regard to the discussion around green bonds, and then also how Africa could harness its green wealth, including biodiversity, to grow its economies. So this, as you already mentioned, Maureen, is a subject that Africa has been relating with in terms of, trading in commodities, quite often with very little minimal value addition, and therefore the rents we get from these resources has also been equally minimal. So what this annual meeting knowledge event seeks to do is to bring leaders to brainstorm on how we can actually measure our natural resources, our green wealth, value our natural resources, and be able to include them in our social accounting matrices, and therefore our computation of gross domestic product, GDP. Because when we are able to do that, you may then find that countries that are actually producing a lot of public goods and global public goods and regional public goods in terms of biodiversity, but also carbon sequestration of forests, by forests and so on, will have some positive externalities that are producing for the global economy, and therefore that can help enhance their GDP growth. So this is specifically what we're trying to do in this particular knowledge event. And you notice that also we have a lot of innovations that has come up, financial innovations, to try and address the climate finance question and the transition to green growth, including the green bonds that was mentioned by Agre. But the Africa's access, a capacity to access those global financial systems has remained low because of several issues: the capacity to prepare projects, the burdensomeness of some of the systems that is put in place for accessing those financing, but a number of capacity and institutional issues that actually crowd out Africa's capacity to be able to absorb, access some of those resources. And Africa has not really benefited so much, even from climate finance, even despite the fact that Africa is most disproportionately impacted by climate change and has not contributed to the climate change as much as other regions. So all those stories are things that are already well known by the media. So this issue now is for us to think home on how do we actually use our natural resources to boost our green wealth and help green transformation in Africa, and therefore position the continent to be able to access higher amounts of capital, be it climate finance, but also for biodiversity and carbon sequestration in the carbon markets and others, in order to be able to finance structural transformation on the continent. You also mentioned the fact that African countries have been in existence for quite a long time, and there's little or very little transformation seen in many countries. Yes, that is the reason why we have selected this topic for this year. This is not to say that African countries have not done marvelously well in growing its economies. The Africa's resilience story is now well known in the sense that despite all the global shocks that buffets the continent, a lot of which are not caused by the countries, African economies continue to rebound and continue to grow significantly every year. So we do project that in 2024, the continent will be growing around 4%, and that is much higher than the global average. And we have over 15 countries, several countries in Africa that is posting growth more than 5%. This is impressive, given all the shocks that the African continent has been facing. And a number of African countries will be or are already among the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. So the African economies are growing fast and doing well, but so is population growth on the continent. And when your population is growing faster or at the same pace as your GDP growth, then the GDP per capita or gross national income per capita doesn't experience that faster growth that you see. And that is why we still see poverty on the continent, because we need a much faster rate of growth in order to be able to break those vicious cycles. And that is why the bank is also working with the African Union on a study to define how Africa, key drivers of how Africa can grow by about 7 to 10% of GDP growth annually for the next 40 years in order to address the issues of poverty and lack of structural transformation on the continent. Thank you.
I'd just like to add to that last question. What is the problem for lack of Africa's development? Is it government, or is it because the leaders are not doing well? Look, of course, Professor Rama has brought the economic aspect of it. We have to also get our governance right. I think we do all agree that Africa has to get its governance right, where the people's expectation will be met. We've had governance challenges, we've had conflicts on the continent, and the bank is working to ensure that those issues of fragility are addressed with, particularly causes of fragility, because when poverty is pervasive, there's a possibility that it could lead to conflict, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Secondly, we have to try to manage our resources well. There have been a whole lot of challenges with regard to what some people will call governance issues, others call it corruption. Just like there's corruption in the rest of the world, but there's a specific issue of how to engage to minimize the waste of resources on the continent. And the bank, in its dialogue with member countries, continue to emphasize good governance in the application of resources. So Africa must come to that point where it sees governance as a very serious instrument for the economic transformation of the continent. And the bank does emphasize that and works closely with each member country to do that. So, and it's also every citizen's responsibility to ensure that Africa transforms well in each space where we are. It's also the province of private sector. working with policies that have been put in place to ensure that Africa transforms better. So we all have to put our hands on deck, government, the private citizens, as well as corporations or private commercial entities to push Africa forward. So we need to get a few things right as Africa to be able to transform the way we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General, and also thank you, Chief Economist Professor Rama, for those responses. And just to recap on what Secretary General said, the two facilities the bank launched following COVID-19, the first one was a 10 billion crisis response facility, and the second one was a $3 billion fight COVID-19 social bond. That was the largest dollar-denominated social bond ever at that particular time. And also what you heard Professor Rama saying about African countries dominating the top 20 list of the fastest growing economies. Now, if you've not checked our website, I will just quickly run through the names. You've got Niger, Libya, Senegal, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire. You've got Ethiopia, Benin, Djibouti, Tanzania, Togo, and Uganda. You can get more details on our website about the performance of the African countries. Let's get in more questions. We are almost just past halfway through our press conference. We've got about 29 minutes remaining. We've got Brian Ngugi, we've got Chikono, and we've got Omar Cloris. So let's see, Brian's name, Melody. Let me go to Melody first. I'll go then to Omar and then Brian. So Melody, the microphone for you. Melody Chikono.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My question is in relation to global financing. I wanted to find out specifically for Zimbabwe, given that our economic situation, the debt situation, the economic meltdown, what are the things that Zimbabwe needs to do right to be able to re-access global financing? Secondly, how can Zimbabwe tap into the sustainability agenda for Africa? How can we leverage on that to make good use of it?
Yeah, thank you, Melody. Thank you so much. Let's go to Omar Elodi. Omar, over to you. Tell us your organization and country, please, where you are.
I'm Omar Elodi, editor-in-chief of Il Boursa. It deals with economics and finance in Tunisia. My question is simple. The theme for the annual meetings has to do with the reform of the international financial architecture, which is already ongoing. Are you going to adopt these ongoing reforms, or are there any reforms that are specific to Africa? And particularly as we know that each country has its specificities when it comes to the reforms of the international financial architecture. Thank you.
Omar, merci beaucoup pour votre question. Omar, vous avez de où? Maroc? Tunis?
Where are you from? Tunisia, thank you.
Then we go to Brian. Yes, Brian. Brian Ngugi, can you hear us? Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon from Nairobi, Kenya.
Good afternoon.
This is Brian Ngugi from the Standard newspaper. I have a question. Which specific debt architecture reforms will be on the table at the AFDB Nairobi meetings? Thanks.
Just come again on that, Brian. What did you exactly want to know?
My question is on the specifics of the debt architecture reforms.
Debt architecture.
Debt architecture reforms.
Okay. Things to do with the debt reforms, if there's anything about data architecture reforms. Thank you so much. We'll take those three questions, starting with Melody on Zimbabwe, then we go to Omar from Tunisia, and then to Brian. Okay, so Professor, you want to go first? You're all both professors, so I need to be very careful which professor. Professor Rama, Vice President.
Yeah, thank you very much. On Zimbabwe, the question is, what are the things that Zimbabwe has to do in order to be able to access the global financial system? Already, I would say the government of Zimbabwe is doing a lot to try and address a number of the issues, one of which is the debt arrears clearance. And as you are aware, the president of Zimbabwe had appointed the president of the African Development Bank and President Chisano to lead in the dialogue of trying to address the issues around debt arrears clearance, and that is progressing really, really very well. So, and also we are working with the Zimbabwean Ministry of Finance and also the Central Bank on producing debt and investment growth models that will allow the country to be able to, come up with the best policies available to them in order to be able to mobilize domestic revenue more, in order to be able to harness the economic opportunities, huge and vast economic competitiveness advantages of that country in order to grow the GDP of the country faster. Because the best way to address debt is to grow your economy. And the government of Zimbabwe fully recognizes that. And I want to really commend my friend and colleague, the Minister of Finance, Minister Nkube, and the President of Zimbabwe, but also the Central Bank Governor. They are really doing a great job in terms of trying to put in place the right preconditions to allow Zimbabwe to take off. And if you look at the GDP growth of the country over the past several years, it's really on a very positive trajectory. So for me, the question is not what should they do, what are the things they have to do. So it's actually the things they are doing and what they should do more of. Now, the other question on the global financial architecture reform that are specific to the continent. The global financial architecture is a global system. So, and Africa as a continent is a member of the global system. And the whole discussion around the global financial architecture is happening globally, but Africa is participating significantly. Through the African Union that we know now, you are aware, it's become accepted as a member of the G20, and we are supporting them significantly to ensure that their participation is informed by data, knowledge, and good policies that will allow Africa to leverage that platform to ensure that the voices of the continent are heard. And also, we also have several other avenues through which the African continent is contributing in that discussion and actually driving the global reform in the global financial architecture significantly. You will be aware of all the financial innovations that has been led by the African Development Bank under the leadership of the President of the African Development Bank and the VP for Finance in the African Development Bank, and of course all the other members of senior management. Some of those reforms, hybrid capital and so on, are actually driving the discussions on how the global financial architecture could be better tailored to address the needs of developing countries. You also know of the issue about the SDR reforms, which has been championed by the African Development Bank under President Akinwumi Adesina's leadership, again shaping the dialogue on how that particular type of fund, the SDRs, can help to fast-track development in developing countries by channeling them through the regional MDBs that can help to accelerate the scale of the financing by leveraging them up to 4%, depending on which region you are looking at. So Africa is actually driving that discussion significantly. Which specific debt architecture will be on the table at the annual meetings. The annual meetings is not focusing on debt, per se, but debt management is a key aspect of the global financial architecture reform. So one would expect that there will be quite a lot of discussion around how to improve the risk rating of countries, risk ratings of countries, and how to improve domestic revenue mobilization for countries, because these are key aspects of how to get the financing on the table for driving the financial, for driving the structural transformation on the continent. And if I go back to the list of knowledge events that we have proposed that is going to hold there, we have one on financing Africa's transformation in a changing financial system. So that is where the whole issues around debt will also be discussed in more detail. Thank you.
Just an intervention on the issue around the reforms, the global financial architecture reforms. Now, I think there's a tendency to misunderstand what the whole theme is all about. If there's anything you want to take away in that whole theme of the global financial architecture reform, take away the fact that the debate is that since 1945, the establishment of what is referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions, the way development finance has been structured and deployed does not favor Africa and the developing world, and there's therefore a need for reform. So if you want to take that as the debate that is going on in Africa, being part and parcel of that debate as a central issue, I mean, after the World War II, Europe was redeveloped totally. But after colonialism, there's hardly any much drive towards rebuilding Africa from that global perspective. It's disparate. And therefore, there's this whole realization that Africa is bringing to the entire world to know that, and all the developing countries, that this has to change. Global capital needs to look more where it is needed, and in this particular current situation of the world, it is needed more in Africa and the developing world than in the developed world. So that is the message, and that's what Africa will be driving at. It's not as though which reform is applicable to Africa and which is not applicable to. That is the central message. So if you, as a journalist, if you're pushing that out there, that is the narrative, and that is the focus. Thank you.
And if I just thank you so much, Secretary General, for clarifying that in more detail. There's also the aspect of how the African countries would reform itself in order to be able to participate better and become more globally competitive in accessing those financial opportunities that exist in several areas. Like I've mentioned, someone has talked about green financing, green bonds, and so on. Despite the availability of those resources, Africa is still accessing very little of that. And when you look at why, it's issues around risk ratings, it's issues around capacity of institutions to be able to prepare the projects. It's also some issues around asymmetric information. People just don't know that those resources are available and how to access them, or capacity to prepare the projects to access them. So the discussion are, number one, yes, we need to improve the global financial architecture to become exactly as discussed by the Secretary General, to channel financing more to where it is needed to achieve the SDGs, but also on the other side, how do we structurally transform our institutions, our economies, so that we can be able to access those financing when they are made available in the global financial architecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rama and Professor Mele, for those interventions. Nous avons des journalistes ici avec.
We have a journalist with us here. Any question from the room? If you have a question, please raise your hand. Give us your name and the press house you come from. Thank you.
Okay, let me go online. We've got a few more questions from colleagues who are on on the webinar. Let's see how many. We still have got about 12 minutes to go. So any journalists listening in now, you've got a question, please raise your hand right away. We've got only 12 minutes remaining. I know we've got nearly 40 journalists on the line, and we've got quite a number of people who have tuned in on YouTube and also on social media. But we want to hear questions and comments from journalists. If you've got a question, raise your hand now. How many do we have? Anybody who's raising their hand? We've got Lucy, we've got Hamidu, and we've got El Heiba. So we'll go in that order, beginning with Lucy, and then Hamidu, and El Heiba. Please say your name and your organization. Thank you. Lucy. Lucy, please. Lucy, if you can unmute yourself. Okay. Yes, we can hear you. Raise your voice. Thank you. Your line is not clear, Lucy. Lucy, we are hearing an echo, and you're not clear. I think that was not a very good line. We've lost her. Yeah, okay, so actually, let's see. Lucy had sent this question, Professor Rama, now that she wants you to answer this question. What role do you see African countries playing in shaping the future of the global financial system? Just what you've been explaining there, but now maybe elaborating a little bit more about the role of Africa, what it should be doing exactly. Hamidu, let's hear from Hamidu. If you can open Hamidu's microphone, and El Heiba. Hamidu?
Oui, bonjour, chers messieurs.
Oui, bonjour.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Amadou Traoré from Burkina Faso. I am the webmaster for an online site. I have two small questions. The first one is, we see new actors on the scene like Russia and China in the continent, and lending to African countries, will this new architecture cover this aspect? This new lending from new actors? I think I will stop there.
Thank you. You said you had two questions, but we'll go with that. Hamidu, thank you for that. El Heiba. El Heiba, please. Joseph, let's get El Heiba, and also we'll have the microphone for Francis from Damui and from Nume. Just admit them in so that when we call them out, they're ready to go. El Heiba, please, unmute yourself. Okay. If we are waiting for El Heiba to be unmuted, and also Francis to be unmuted, Nume to be unmuted, and Daumi to be unmuted, we've got only about 9 minutes remaining, and if we can have them on the microphone, that would be very good. Blessed Sogan from Joy FM in Ghana. Okay, Nume, you are ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, let's get from Nume.
Okay, hi, my name is Nume from this newspaper, Nigeria. So my question will be on Nigeria. How can Nigeria access more climate and financing, as well as in recent times, AFDB has supported Nigeria in different various interventions, but there is a concern that are we getting to a point where there may be some sort of debt trap and all that? So can you speak on Nigeria's debt stance and indebtedness to AFDB and its general outlook on Nigerian economy.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Nome. And let's see who is next, Ndamui or Francis? Or El Heiba?
I'm unmuted.
Okay, Francis, go next. Very good.
Okay, thank you. So recently, the bank approved some.
Which country are you from, Francis?
From Ghana.
Okay.
So recently, the bank approved some 102.59 million for Ghana's economic recovery and fiscal consolidation program amid the IMF no support program. I would want to know, considering that during every election period, Ghana overspends, what would be the recommendation of the bank as Ghana implements its loan support program, which has received some support from the AFDB?
All right. Thank you for that. Professor, I want Francis to repeat that question, isn't it? Yeah, Francis, just come again on what exactly you want to know about the bank's support for Ghana. Just come again.
Okay, so the bank approved some $102.5 million for Ghana's fiscal consolidation and economic recovery program. But it has been observed that during election period like this year, 2024, Ghana usually overspends. I want to know what will be the bank's advice to Ghanaian authorities in an election period that they are implementing an IMF support program that has received some money from the bank.
I think the SG is nodding now. I think we have understood your question. Let's try El Heiba. I'm really keen we get El Heiba's question in. El Heiba.
Oui, excusez-moi pour.
My apologies for the technical hitches. I am Al Heiba Del Akbar from Mauritania. So my question is, what are the repercussions of the changes in the Sahel regions on the activities of the ADB? I'm referring to countries like Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. That is the question I had. What are the repercussions of the developments in these countries on the activities of the ADB?
Yeah, Ndamui. Ndamui? Hello, Ndamui, can you hear us? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Yes.
My name is Ndamu Sando. I use the newspaper in Zimbabwe. Southern Africa is facing a wind-induced drought with 30 countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, having declared a state of disaster. I wanted to find out how is the bank going to assist these countries to avoid starvation.
Okay, in the movie, question from Zimbabwe on starvation. We had another one from earlier on, again on Zimbabwe. We had Hamid who was talking about lending to Africa with the new players, Russia and China. And we had climate financing from Nigeria from Nume, and debt financing as well. And then Francis from Ghana speaking about election period coming up. And Ghana has already been borrowing money, and they tend to spend so much money during this period of time. What advice can the bank give to Ghana? So who wants to go first? Professors. SG.
I will take the Ghana question. And I don't know that a bank will give Ghana advice on how to spend its loan. The bank doesn't necessarily give orders to a sovereign country. As much as it's possible, the bank preaches financial prudence to ensure that countries do not get into debt distress. And that's why we have our governance department at the bank, which works with countries to ensure that they do not get into debt distress, they're able to borrow and be able to pay accordingly. So whether election or no election, I'm not sure the bank is in a position to tell a country how to use its money. But when a country is trying to approach the bank for resources, there are steps there are measurements that the bank engages with the country and be able to ensure that the country gets receive what it needs. Economic recovery for Ghana is what Ghana has decided to do based on its negotiations and engagement with the IMF and other banks. And so I know that elections are political periods and people have different opinions, but when a country embarks on economic recovery, it's a serious business. And all the bank can do is to support them to ensure that they arrive at the destination, not to tell them, please don't use the money for election or whatever. I'm not sure that we're in a position to do so. But I'll leave the rest to VP Orama.
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions as well. In terms of new actors on the scene, China, Russia, and others lending to countries, and it wasn't so clear to me how the question that was being asked, how will this affect the global financial reform agenda? Like I've said, the global financial reform, financial system is a global system, and that includes all member countries of the global planet that we are discussing, including all the members of the United Nations Assembly. So, and that includes both China and Russia and all the other countries as well. So the decision in terms of where to access financing and when to access financing, on what terms the financing are accessed, is of the country to make. And then countries that approach the African Development Bank, we have the Africa Legal Support Facility, ALSF. We also have the Economic Governance Department that is headed by my brother Abdullahi Coulibaly, who is here today as well. We provide support to countries on ensuring that they maintain fiscal prudence. And in that maintaining fiscal prudence will include both where to access the financing, how to access the financing, on what terms you have accessed those financing, but also, more importantly, how you use those financing to drive development on the continent, in your countries, in order to be able to generate the revenue that can repay your loan and avoid debt sustainability challenges. And we work collectively with the World Bank, with the IMF, and other agencies in order to do that. And in terms of what advice we give countries, the bank has established the Public Financial Management Academy that is actually working with countries and providing training to officials in these countries to address those issues about domestic revenue mobilization, debt management, public financial management, and all the issues around fiscal prudence that we've been talking about. And last year, we also established a debt managers network for Africa, where we have all the debt managers coming together to compare notes and also learn from the experiences of others, both in Africa and globally, in order to ensure that we can manage our debt better than we have been doing in the past. Now, the other question on Nigeria, specific also on accessing climate finance, there are general issues that we have talked about in terms of having bankable projects, the capacity to prepare those projects, have long-term strategies for addressing climate change that will feed into the nationally determined contributions and that will also then inform what kinds of projects that can be financed in those countries. But it all boils down to the capacity of the institutions to be able to access that. And another complex, the Power, Energy, Climate Change, and Green Growth Complex, headed by Vice President Kevin Kariuki, is doing a marvelous work in helping build capacities of countries in order to be able to access those financing as much as possible. And I know that Nigeria is part of the countries that they have been working on. On the debt issues that's raised in Nigeria, the debt to GDP ratio in Nigeria is still sustainable. But the issue in Nigeria is with regard to debt to revenue ratio, and that is why the government of the country is doing quite a lot in order to improve revenue mobilization in the country. And by increasing the revenue mobilization, they will be able to rebalance that ratio and be able to move forward. Now, one point I need to make clearly is that debt is not a bad thing. Debt for growth is always a means of driving transformative growth in countries. And the issue is not about the debt, it's about the quality of the debt in terms of what do you borrow, on what terms do you borrow, how transparent they are, and then what you use that borrowings, the resources borrowed, to do. If it is invested in growth-enhancing infrastructure and productive infrastructure, you are going to be able to generate revenue to be able to repay the loans, but still also grow your economy. And that is how most countries grow. So in Africa, quite often when we discuss debt, there seems to be a negative connotation. Debt shouldn't carry a negative connotation. Bad debt should carry a negative connotation. So when you borrow on wrong terms, when it is intransparent, and people don't know exactly what is happening, and then also when the resources are not used properly, then you can get into the debt sustainability challenge. So the Public Financial Management Academy of the bank is established to help countries not to get there. So when you are borrowing, you know exactly what you are borrowing and when to borrow, who to borrow from, and what terms of the borrowing, and how to also use those loans in order to be able to drive transformative growth in countries. So please, for the journalists here, please let note that debt for growth is not a bad thing. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor. There was something about the new players who are lending to Africa, Russia, and China. I just wondered whether they want to touch on that briefly. Okay, that's done, isn't it? Okay, thanks a lot, okay, for that. I think we've had questions from North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, Francophone, Anglophone, Arabophone, and I think the Lusophone Africa will not forgive us if we don't tackle this question from Anna Paula from Lusa. Says, can we have some more details about green bonds? Which countries are already benefiting or benefiting more from these instruments? Okay, yeah, I think we missed on that one. Yes, so, yes. Drought, yes. All right. So you want to tackle the one on green bonds, and maybe you could combine plus the support for Southern Africa, and perhaps through initiatives that the bank does through TAT. Okay. Let's start with the SGA
on the drought situation in Southern Africa in terms of what the bank is doing. The bank does support the Africa Risk Capacity Agency, which is ARC, which also has an insurance arm through which member countries that belong to the ARC treaty benefit from payment of premiums to address extreme weather conditions such as flood and drought. And I know that Malawi, for example, had a payout at a particular time, and Madagascar also did have a payout. Apart from special relief that the bank does give when such situations occur, the insurance premium payouts also are geared towards addressing those. I'm yet to, I don't have it off the cuff now as to whether or not any relief request had come from those countries to the bank. And normally when it does come, the bank does respond swiftly using the special relief fund that the bank has to address those issues. And so these are the mechanisms towards addressing the drought issues. And of course, specifically, there could be other project financing that the countries may require to address those issues from a programmatic point of view in terms of the country's needs, in addition to other things that I've mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, and also to add, one of the ways of addressing the climate, the physical impacts of climate change is by building climate resilience in countries. And the bank has, since 2015, really stepped up its lending with regard to addressing the climate resilience in countries, building climate adaptation capacity in countries. Because the best way to address the climate impacts is not to wait until it happens, but actually to prepare your infrastructure and your economy to be able to be resilient, which means to bounce back after the shock that has happened. And there's quite a lot of work you'll find on the bank's website that the bank has been supporting, both in Southern Africa, but in other regions of the continent to address the climate adaptation capacity of those countries. Now, on the issue of green bond, I can tell you in general that access to green financing and green bonds in Africa has been low compared to the other regions. I think below 2% of the global green bonds that are available has been accessed by Africa. And the specific countries that have accessed it more, I don't have off the cuff now to give you, but you will find that also in our AEO 2022 when we looked at these climate financing issues. And one fact that is there is that countries that are at higher growth trajectories, countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and many of the other countries, Egypt, Morocco, and the rest of them, countries that are better developed in terms of infrastructure and human capacity in the ministries have greater chances of accessing those climate financing instruments better than others. But like I said, I don't have the specific countries that have accessed green bonds off the cuff now, but that can be accessed when you look at the website of the African Development Bank and read the AEO report 2022. But in how we access climate finance in Africa and how we relate with the global financial architecture in Africa is at the center of this, the knowledge events that we're going to be having. So I encourage you to please chime in when we are going to be having those knowledge events, be part of the discussion, be part of the debate, and also the dissemination of the knowledge that will come out. Because the current structure, like the Secretary General has already pointed out, the way the current structure is laid out does not allow many African countries to access them at scale to be able to address the climate challenges that we have, but also to address structural transformation on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rama. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, we've reached the end of this press conference. I'm sorry to overrun by 10 minutes, and this is because of your very, very insightful questions. We had a variety of questions from you, and I do appreciate the homework you put into this and the desire you've demonstrated wanting to learn more about what the bank is doing and the bank's perspective on those big things or issues. Like the global financial architecture and the need to reform it. And I believe this discussion will go on all the way to Nairobi, and I'm hoping that you will be there. So today, you've heard about the annual meetings for the African Development Bank Group. They'll be held in Nairobi, Kenya, at the Kenyatta International Conference Center from the 27th to 31st of May, and the theme will be the transformation, the Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture. Why this matters, you've heard from Professor Mehele, the Secretary General, as well as Professor Rama, Vice President for Governance and Knowledge Management and Chief Economist. And as you heard from the Secretary General again, we'll have 4,000 delegates. This will be drawn from all the 54 regional member countries, shareholders of the African Development Bank Group. They're all members of the bank, all the 54 African countries, together with the 27 non-regional member countries or shareholders. And this discussion continues on social media with the hashtag AFDBAM2024. Do visit our bank's website. The annual meetings website is there as well. You'll be able to see all those details. And if you've got any further question, please do communicate with the Communication and External Relations Department. We've got a whole team of colleagues here who will be happy to help you. May I once again extend my gratitude to our chief guests here today who've been fielding your questions, the Secretary General, Professor Vincent Mehle, and Chief Economist and Vice President for Governance and Knowledge Management, Professor Kevin Chika Urama. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen of the press. Have a very good afternoon. Thank you.